Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this conversation with Troy Bramston, who has recently published Gough Whitlam, The Vista of the New. We're meeting tonight on the traditional lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and my name is David Dutton. I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute. So welcome to everyone in the room and to our audience watching online. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam brought new vision and energy to Australian diplomacy. In the words of the first director of this institute, Alan Gyngell, he released a torrent of changes which gave expression to deeper shifts in Australia that had been unfolding over the 1960s and the strategic turbulence of the early 70s. 3 days after his election, Whitlam said, "The general direction of my thinking is towards a more independent Australian stance in international affairs, an Australia which will be less militarily orientated and not open to suggestions of racism, an Australia which will enjoy a growing standing as a distinctive, tolerant, cooperative and well-regarded nation, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but in the world at large." Even by our standards in 2025, the torrent of change was really quite extraordinary and the events tumultuous. In slightly less than 3 years, the Whitlam government unleashed a raft of initiatives and decisions which modernised Australian foreign policy. And most of those were carried forward by the Fraser government, and many endure half a century later. There was, just to recall quickly, the opening to China, the accelerated withdrawal from Vietnam, independence for Papua New Guinea, the dismantling of White Australia, the start of negotiations over what became the Nara Treaty with Japan. Australia became the first dialogue partner of ASEAN. There was repositioning of Australia in the UN on decolonisation and on North-South issues, an avalanche of 133 treaties, including major ones like ratification of the NPT, the major human rights treaties, and so forth. And not to forget, important constitutional changes which advanced Australia's independence from Britain. There are also issues which look more dubious to posterity and will come later to Whitlam's handling of Indonesia's incorporation of East Timor. And there's been historical controversy at times over Whitlam's handling of the American alliance and his relationship with Nixon and Kissinger, and we'll touch on that too. So this evening we're going to crash through this transformative period in Australian history, and our guest is Troy Bramston, the author of Gough Whitlam, The Vista of the New, which you've seen on your way in. Troy is a distinguished senior writer at the Australian newspaper and the author of 12 books, including political biographies of Prime Ministers Bob Hawke, Bob Menzies and Paul Keating. This book was launched last month by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and it's the first full biography of Gough Whitlam since his death in 2014. It's rightly attracted a lot of attention and praise around the nation, and especially on the recent 50th anniversary of the Dismissal a few weeks ago. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Troy Bramston to the stage. Well, look, Troy, thanks very much for being with us. The way we'll organise things this evening is I'm going to ask Troy questions for about half an hour or so, and then we're going to come to you in the audience, and you'll have your chance to ask him some questions as well. So get those ready. I thought we're going to focus on international affairs, Australia and the world, and what Whitlam brought to those issues. This being the Lowy Institute, but it's best, I think, to start out by asking Troy, well, why did you write this book? Tell us about, I think you had new sources, both archival and interviews, and perhaps tell us a bit about the kind of major themes of the book before we go to the kind of international aspects.
Sure. Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming. And I know there's a lot of people watching online as well. It's great to be back here at the Lowy Institute. I've spoken here before and been on the podcast, and I know a lot of the people who work here. So thank you for having me back. Look, of course, it's the 50th anniversary of the end of the Whitlam government this year, and so I was mindful of that anniversary. But, in writing biographies of prime ministers, I'm really interested in political power. So how power is gained, how it's used, and inevitably how it's lost. And so I'm really interested in that component of our politics. It's a biography, of course, it's a full life story. So you talk about every aspect of his life and what motivated him to do certain things and make assessments. But, you know, how he actually led and how he sought to lead is critical for me. And so I interviewed more than 100 people for the book. I was able to access archives here and overseas for the first time, get a lot of things opened up and provide a new vantage point on Whitlam and his government and his life, and made a number of really interesting discoveries. And so that's really why I sort of set about to do this book. And I should say too that I knew Gough, and in the last sort of decades of his life, I'd see him from time to time and go and visit him at his office and talk to him. So I got a really good understanding of what his personality was like, and he was always, a fun person to be around. He always had interesting stories. He was a window into history for me, but he was always an interesting person, and I think his government was kind of a hinge point in our history, a turning point moment across many policy areas where we never looked back in a different direction. But of course, Gough was very flawed, and his government, despite leaving a big legacy, was chaotic and often dysfunctional and scandalised. And so I try to sort of analyse how that personality of him, in many ways being often the best thing going for the government, but sometimes the worst thing going for the government. So it was a really fascinating process for me to look at how an individual, through the prism of biography, can change a nation and how they lead a government and how they lead a party.
Yeah. So could we start with, Whitlam entered the Parliament in 1952, so he was in the Parliament for 20 years before he became Prime Minister. You recount his relationship with Evatt. He was in the Parliament at the time of the Petrov affair and right through that Cold War period. He developed a very active interest in international affairs. The book talks about how he took extraordinary trips by, certainly by some contemporary standards. He would travel overseas for 6 or 7 weeks at a time, go to a dozen countries, did this kind of year on year. And by the time he became Prime Minister, he had built a range of relationships in the region and the world already. So, but maybe you could just take us through, how do you see his kind of intellectual development from that connection from Evatt through to becoming leader and what his outlook was when he became Prime Minister?
Yeah, so he goes to Sydney University in the pre-war years. Of course, his focus was the classics. He wasn't really doing international policy or international issues, but his father was an international humanitarian. His father was involved in the World Council of Churches. His father was later Commonwealth Crown Solicitor. So he's involved in international legal issues and in the community of nations around the world. And his father went to the United Nations for different religious conferences and things like that. So he'd kind of grown up in that atmosphere. He's living in Canberra from the moment the new national capital comes into being. So he's actually the first Prime Minister to grow up in Canberra, and he's seeing this new national capital literally rise from the red dirt. And so that has a big impact on him around a whole range of policy and political issues and meeting personalities. His father knew Evatt, of course, and the family admired Evatt and the role he'd played in World War II. As Minister for External Affairs. But I think also because he had served in World War II as a flight navigator, based in Western Australia, the Northern Territory, and in parts of the region, that also gave him a real insight into international policy issues. So, he became very committed to a process of decolonisation, I guess, and sort of interested in the world map that had been redrawn after World War II. So these are sort of the formative influences, I think, in his outlook. And then, of course, foreign policy looms very large in Australian politics in the 1950s and 1960s when he's in the Parliament. And so there's a whole range of issues, the Petrov matter, as you mentioned, David, but there's the Vietnam War, there's the US alliance, there's a whole lot of things happening. And he's sort of seeing Australia's role in the region and thinking that we can do better in terms of how we relate to the countries in our own hemisphere rather than being an Anglophile country. So he's very motivated by some of these issues, and it reflects really his personal experiences, I think, and his upbringing rather than some kind of focused academic study.
Yeah. All right, so let's Maybe we should start then with Vietnam as from when he became Prime Minister in December 1972, and he of course won on a platform of immediate and complete withdrawal. Conscription was still in place at the time of the election, and then the Paris Peace Agreement was signed in Paris the following month in January 1973. Whitlam believed that the conflict would end only with unification on the North's terms, which is ultimately kind of what then happened later in his term in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. So maybe just be interested in more about Whitlam's role at the end of the Vietnam War, but then also this connection then into a different outlook on Asia. I think he at the time talked about sort of post-ideological or sort of relations beyond ideology, meaning moving beyond sort of some of the Cold War frames that had been so strong in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, look, he really had a realpolitik view of these issues. He wasn't really sentimental about relationships and so on. And so the Vietnam War, of course, had been the deployment of Australian troops in May 1965 had been opposed by Labor. Arthur Corwell was then Labor's leader. He was then the deputy leader. And so Corwell made this a strong point of principle and gave a very famous speech in the Parliament, which a lot of people might remember, opposing the war but trying to balance also supporting the alliance, but opposing this deployment. And so Whitlam was never at the front lines of the kind of moratorium marches or these kind of protests. He was more careful and more cautious. But of course, by the time he's Labor leader and by the time he becomes Prime Minister, the Vietnam War had gone sour, right? So the Australian people were largely against it. And one of the biggest issues which I discovered and didn't fully recognise was conscription. So conscription is a really big issue in Australia, and in 1972, that's probably the key reason why voters 21 and over, under say 30, started really aligning themselves with the Labor Party. So this became a really big issue, and one of the first things Whitlam did was end conscription and free conscientious objectors from jail and stop those prosecutions that were being mounted against people who had refused to serve. So this was a big issue. And when I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers, which included Australia's involvement, he told me that he was shocked that an alliance country like Australia would conscript young men to serve in this war. And that was one of the motivations he had, he thought, for, frankly, he said, embarrassing Australia. So it's very interesting, and so he inherits this conflict, and he had always been opposed to it as his party, but he removes those final troops, but he gets into this conflict, I guess, with Richard Nixon over the Christmas bombing in 1972. And so that sets up a bit of a flashpoint for the alliance, which we'll talk about. But what I found was that Whitlam was realpolitik, but unsentimental on these issues. And so by 1975, when the war's over in Vietnam, there's about 140,000 refugees, and Australia only allowed in about 1,000. It's not that generous, and that's not a great aspect of his legacy. Some of this was Operation Baby Lift, orphans, that some of you may remember, but it wasn't particularly generous, and there's a lot of disputes within the Whitlam government about whether or not we would want I guess, those who were in South Vietnam coming to Australia. So this became a really controversial issue, and it doesn't reflect that well, I think, on Whitlam in terms of how open-minded he was to allowing these refugees to come here.
Yeah. So let me ask about China. So I guess the most famous of Whitlam's diplomatic achievements is the opening to China. He had called for recognition of the PRC in 1954. It had become recognition of Beijing had become part of the ALP platform in 1955. So it had been a long-established part of the Labor platform. But then in July 1971, with more than a bit of risk, he decided to visit China. And then recognised Beijing in December 1972. And we've, of course, all seen, I guess, the Prime Minister's visit to China this year and a bit of reenactment of some of those scenes. So tell us about the China story and his trip in July '71, and where that kind of fitted in his outlook. I guess this was long overdue.
Yeah, so the Labor Party had that position about China, and when I wrote a biography of Robert Menzies, I was interested to read some of the cabinet debates around 49, 50, 51, where the Menzies government were debating whether or not to recognise Mao's China, and they decided not to do that. So this had been a long-standing Labor policy, and then when there was a dispute over the wheat trade in 1971, the Labor Party decided to send a delegation to China, and it was great to go through some of these records and look at that debate. Originally, it was just going to be Labor's rural affairs spokesman Rex Patterson go to China and try to get some kind of commitment to restart the wheat trade. But then it became a bigger delegation, and there were lots of debates about who would go on the delegation, who wouldn't. And then Whitlam decided that he would go, and his speechwriter Graham Freudenberg, he thought it was a bad idea. But then Whitlam asked if he would go with him, and he said that at the start of 1971, he thought there'd be a better chance he'd go to the moon than go to China. But so they went, and this was a big moment on the world stage. This is an American ally, the opposition party in Australia, going to China. Whitlam called it a moment of high adventure and great risk, and they went there. And of course, he got to meet Zhou Enlai, and were greeted very well, and promised there would be diplomatic recognition if there was a Labor government, and there was a sort of a vague commitment to restart the wheat trade. But of course, the Chinese knew what Whitlam didn't know, and that was that Henry Kissinger was about to arrive to negotiate a visit from Richard Nixon. And so it's very interesting that the Chinese decided that Whitlam would come first, and he would be followed by Kissinger. And of course, the McMahon government, Billy McMahon's government, were up in arms about this and attacked Whitlam quite strongly, said he was being played by the Chinese like a fisherman plays a trout. And then, of course, it was announced as Whitlam was arriving in Tokyo that Henry Kissinger was arriving in Peking. And so this was a great vindication, a validation of Whitlam going there. It was a masterstroke, but a lucky masterstroke, let's call it that. And so Billy McMahon was furious, and it's amazing to read the letters he writes to Richard Nixon, complaining, how could you not tell us that you were contemplating this? I've been embarrassed, I look foolish, and so on. And so this was a big coup for Whitlam. And then so they provide diplomatic recognition in 1972, and then he goes there in 1973 and he meets Mao. And the story of him meeting Mao is one of the great stories where a lot of it was shrouded in secrecy and uncertainty. And eventually he goes into this apartment where Mao's staying, and I interviewed Stephen Fitzgerald, who became the ambassador, of course, and he said, Mao's bed was literally in the corner, and they kind of drugged him up and propped him up so that he could have this meeting with Whitlam. But that was a big moment, and it's interesting to see Anthony Albanese, I think, recognising some of these milestones that have come with his prime ministership at the 50-year mark, including the China relationship. So that was seen as a really important step for Australia, but it was controversial at the time, and a lot of Australians didn't support it. And Labor Party polling, for example, in 1971, 72 said this is not a vote winner here. There's a lot of uncertainty about the relationship, a lot of suspicion about China. But in history's judgment, it was seen as the right call.
Yeah, and I noticed in the book that I think you said it says that there was a review of the 1969 election in which kind of foreign and defence policy was a negative for Labor. Yet, kind of 3 years later, events have kind of broken their way on China, on Vietnam, on the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in politics, you got to be lucky, and you got to have good timing. And so, on some of those issues, China and Vietnam, the fortune favoured Whitlam by 1972.
Yeah. So I guess I think the most controversial issue of Whitlam's time in office was Indonesia's incorporation of East Timor, and it'll be the 50th anniversary of the invasion of East Timor this weekend. And there's been a lot of scrutiny of the Australian role or the Australian policy towards those events. inquests and inquiries around the Ballabo Five, reviews, and for those of us who remember the 90s, you'll remember that, of course, this was this was the big issue in Australian foreign policy in the 90s when I was at university, and people came out on campuses everywhere that Gareth Evans went in those years. There were protesters sort of drawing attention to this issue. Whitlam was often seen as having provided at least a tacit endorsement and of the invasion. And actually, I've read an article just in the last week, which was more framed in terms of betraying the Timorese people. So perhaps take us through this. I mean, both the kind of relationship with Indonesia that Whitlam was attempting to create, and then the kind of very difficult and perhaps unsuccessful attempt to reconcile dealing with East Timor and self-determination.
Yeah, I think, David, this is probably the issue that through the 1990s into the 2000s dogged Whitlam the most. It's the number one issue, and it's a complex issue, and so it's worth explaining his position. Again, it's that realpolitik frame that he took to it, and there's John Howard said there was a very bipartisan position, literally right up until the independence vote in 1999 that Indonesia is the priority relationship for Australia here. It's not East Timor. So people might have different value judgments about that, different perspectives on that, but that was the bipartisan position. So when I went back and looked at all the diplomatic reports, the cables and so on, and some of these have been progressively opened up, but there was some new material that I was able to get opened up. It's pretty clear that Australian policymakers are favouring Indonesia and didn't want to do anything to jeopardise that relationship for quite obvious reasons there. And Whitlam's concern was that Indonesia would not be a viable state on its own after Portugal retreated. There was a military coup in Portugal in 1974, and that started a process of decolonisation of its empire, and East Timor was one of them. And so Whitlam thought it wouldn't be a viable state. He thought it could be a risk to Australia, that it could be a haven for pro-communist leaders, and it would be a thorn in the Australian side. Now, the Indonesians, their view was they obviously wanted East Timor to be part of them, and gave Whitlam repeated promises, this is President Suharto, that there would not be a violent invasion, but I think in hindsight that's probably propaganda. And so Whitlam meets Suharto in 1974 and 1975, and he says, my view is that East Timor should be part of Indonesia, but he didn't support a violent takeover, he didn't support an invasion, and he supported an ill-defined process of self-determination, where the East Timorese people could determine their own future. But he did say to Suharto, I think it should be part of Indonesia. So for Whitlam's critics, that is kind of the trigger that Indonesia needed, the sort of the green flag, let's call it that. And so this is a controversial matter. And I interviewed the president of East Timor, Jose Ramos Horta, here in Sydney. I'd arranged that, and he's scathing about Whitlam, and I've actually written about this for The Australian tomorrow to mark the 50th anniversary. He's scathing of Whitlam, and he thought that Whitlam could have appealed to the United States and appealed to Portugal to stop Indonesia from invading. Now, that's probably a wishful hope at the time. The US were not going to intervene, just as they wouldn't intervene regarding the Dutch in New Guinea. Yeah. So they're not going to do that. So that was the argument that was put. So it's a complex issue. Whitlam never supported invasion or annexation by force, but he did give that kind of acknowledgement that it should be part of Indonesia. The other thing is the Ballabo Five, the 5 Australian-based journalists. I think a lot of people came to this issue through that prism. And this is where, again, it's complex, where Whitlam had told the journalists, we can't protect you if you go to report on what was expected to be an invasion. It's a high-risk scenario, and as a journalist myself, I know lots of journalists that have worked in the foreign field, and they know that there's risk in doing so. And the journalists were actually reporting from Ballabo that an invasion was likely and imminent, and so they knew that. But again, Ramos Horta told me that Whitlam should have told the Indonesians, these are non-combatants, and we've got Australian-based journalists there, and they need to be protected. So that's a valid criticism to make where Whitlam didn't do that. And then, of course, when they were murdered, it was later concluded through coronial inquiries that it was the Indonesian forces who did do that, that Whitlam wasn't timely enough in sharing information with the families of those journalists, and wasn't hard enough in pushing Indonesia to launch an investigation. So they're valid criticisms there as well. So this is probably the foreign policy issue that dogs him, and I think really your political perspective will dictate in many ways which side you come down on. And I, in the book, just try to explain this complexity, express his view, but what are the alternative views, and people can make up their own mind about that.
Yeah. So another controversy, but I think a lesser one, and one more of a controversy among historians, has been about the Whitlam government's relationship with Washington. And of course, there's always been conspiracy theories as well, and including in relation to the dismissal.
Yeah.
Your book concludes, I think, quite definitively that the alliance and the facilities at Pine Gap, at Northwest Cape, at Narungga were never in doubt. That Nixon and Ford and Kissinger, saw Whitlam essentially as he was, as a kind of a moderate, but with some more, kind of radical members of his own cabinet. But he also did irritate, as you already mentioned, irritated certainly Nixon on more than one occasion, and starting with the Christmas bombings in 1972. So take us through what you've uncovered and how you sort of reached those judgments.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about this, and I went back and looked at all the records that are available. I travelled to the United States, went to the Richard Nixon Library, the Gerald Ford Library. I looked at the records here in Australia to sort of get a good understanding about this. Sometimes historians like to go back to what other historians have looked at and see if you can still form the same judgments. And it's pretty clear to me from the documents that the Americans saw Whitlam as an alliance supporter. He'd never been anti-American, he'd never been anti the alliance. He'd always defended the alliance through the 1950s, through the 1960s, when there were these huge debates within the Labor Party, debates in Parliament and so on. So he's an alliance supporter. He's very moderate in that sense. And there's this great account I have in the book of him visiting Lyndon Johnson in 1967. Whitlam is 6'4", Johnson's 6'3", and they stand in the Oval Office together, and they have this amazing hour or so together. And Billy Graham is there, and there's can you believe, I think it's Miss Rural Electrification beauty pageant on the White House lawns, and Whitlam gets to meet them. And Whitlam actually says to the media that the United States is the greatest country in the world. No Australian Prime Minister would say that today, but he did. So he loved America and thought they had played a very positive role in the world. And so the Americans knew this. And you can read the CIA assessments right back to the 1950s, where they knew he was kind of their man in Australia, that he would defend this alliance and these facilities. So that's kind of the background I think that's important. And it is true that the United States did review the alliance, and this is what's known as the National Security Study Memorandum 204. They did review it, but there had been more than 200 of these reviews into different aspects of foreign policy, including when Billy McMahon was Prime Minister. They reviewed the alliance then. And this study that was done, a lot of emphasis has been placed on it, but when I actually read the study in the Gerald Ford Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, of all places, where his papers are, the study actually concludes from the National Security Council that we should defend this alliance, we should maintain it, and actually try to expand it because the facilities were too important to the Americans. So that's the conclusion to draw from the documents. It's not that the alliance was ever in risk, and I think that is without any doubt whatsoever. It doesn't mean there weren't personality clashes. Of course they were concerned with what they called extreme left ministers like Tom Uran and Lionel Murphy and Jim Cairns, but they thought they could work with Whitlam, and also Lance Barnard, who was the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister. They saw these two guys as worthwhile, and they would defend the alliance. And so once you look at these documents, I then wanted to test them with people that were there. So I should say Michael Fullylove, the Executive Director here, put me in touch with Winston Lord, who was Henry Kissinger's deputy at the National Security Council, and he told me that the alliance was never in jeopardy. It's too important to the Americans. And he said the Americans never made decisions based on personality clashes. They made it based on policy interest, right? And so clearly there's a policy interest for the Americans to keep things like Pine Gap operating. And then I got a chance to speak to Henry Kissinger, one of the last interviews that he did before he died, and he essentially said the same thing. He said, look, Whitlam and Nixon didn't get along very well, and you can find those notorious tapes or memos where Nixon, tees off against a whole lot of different personalities. But he said Nixon often spoke figuratively, not literally. So you've got to analyse what he's saying and take it with a grain of salt. So yes, he might have, slagged off Gough Whitlam, but he wasn't going to junk the alliance because he had a personality clash. So testing documents with people that help write these documents is actually really important. I was able to do that. And just to be sure, I asked Paul Keating and John Howard, who had dealt with many US presidents over many years, whether they ever thought the alliance was in jeopardy, and they said definitively no. And anyone who argues that, they thought, is wide of the mark. So I think this is an important contribution to make, and I know that a number of other historians might have some different views, but I do think this is definitive. There were clashes, there were disagreements, the alliance was reviewed, but in the end, there's no evidence that it was ever going to be junked.
Yeah, okay. And I guess we continue to try to discern the figurative from the literal at times in Washington now too, right? So
absolutely, you got to be able to
it's got a
divine that
origin. Right. Let me move on to the end of White Australia, which I'd like to ask you about. So the Whitlam government, I think, was really pivotal in forging modern Australia's approach to immigration and race. He moved Australia to a non-discriminatory immigration policy, ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, passed a Racial Discrimination Act, brought some of the states into compliance with that act in bringing it forward, and adopted a policy of multiculturalism. In December '72, he banned visits of racially selected sporting teams, changed Australia's approach to South Africa and Rhodesia. And at the same time, I think in many of his speeches, you see how he talks about the treatment of Australia's First Nations peoples as also an integral question to Australia's standing in the world. You've touched on the kind of refugee question already, but maybe just could you elaborate on this? It seems like certainly to me, this is one of the important achievements of the Whitlam period, which has certainly been sustained because that has been the kind of foundation of our policy since. But maybe you can elaborate on how Whitlam saw that and where that fitted in his outlook.
Yeah, I think it's important to say at the outset, the big turn on the White Australia policy happens with Harold Holt's government. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And when I wrote a biography of Robert Menzies, I wanted to understand this, and Robert Menzies was reluctant to change the White Australia policy towards a non-discriminatory immigration policy. And Hubert Opperman, who was the immigration minister and a famous cyclist, he was the one who had put cabinet submissions up trying to get Menzies to relax the White Australia policy, but they were rejected. And so when Harold Holt became Prime Minister 60 years ago next month, he did make that change. But it was a slow change. It's a process change. And so by the time, I had to really get to the bottom of this because there's a lot of historical conflict about who's responsible for this. And, victory, they say, what I wanted to say is that Whitlam kind of extended that process, right? Finished it, what we call the final vestiges of the White Australia policy. And so things like, I was able to discover that, can you believe this, that in a number of posts around the world, they could still make a decision on an application to immigrate to Australia based on the colour of somebody's skin. And they could still do physical inspections of somebody to decide whether or not they are worthy of a visa. So there's things what we would call as, procedures, policies, directions given to different posts about how they make immigration decisions. So all of that was done away with. And that's really important. And so, as you mentioned, David, there's the Racial Discrimination Act. That's another element. the policy of multiculturalism, which was championed by Al Grasby. That's important too. There's, language and how you speak about these matters also matters too. And, things like, it's not just about one policy or one law being passed, it's a range of things. And so I was really interested in things like, the world's first, for Australia, the first telephone interpreter service, right? Things like that could make new migrants to this country feel welcome and be able to, access services if they needed it. Things like ethnic broadcasting on radio. I mean, Malcolm Fraser's government brought in SBS, but ethnic broadcasting on radio began during the Whitlam government. So there's a whole sea change in attitudes and outlooks, as well as laws and policies and programs. And so by the end of 1975, there's really nothing left that could in any way be interpreted as a relic of the White Australia policy.
Yeah. And then I think, as you mentioned Fraser, and Fraser then really carries that forward very strongly himself personally too.
Yeah, and also internationally too, with like campaigns against apartheid in South Africa and things like that. So Australia started to advocate this on the world stage. And, Whitlam's speech to the United Nations and in all countries around the world, he started to talk about how Australia is colourblind when it comes to racial matters. And Malcolm Fraser certainly continued that and elevated it even further.
Yeah. Right, so I have one more question, and then we're going to go to our audience. So the last question I wanted to ask you really was about sort of comparing or connecting to our present government, the Albanese government, with Whitlam. So the PM has been in office actually during this period in which it's been 50 years since the Whitlam government, and so he's been, I think, been to a number of anniversary events. I had a look at his speeches and saw that when he spoke about the Whitlam period in terms of international affairs, and he would usually he came really to three things. He'd come to China, he'd come to the ASEAN relationship, and to the independence of PNG. Looked at the foreign minister's speeches, and hers are. She speaks more about this, given her role. And she says, in talking about the Whitlam's legacy, she talks much more about orientation to Asia. She gives much more emphasis to race and First Nations people and decolonisation and those kind of aspects of Whitlam's thinking she draws out in more depth. But I guess I wanted to ask, it's a long 50 years is a long time. Whitlam was in fact closer to Curtin and Chifley than we are to him.
Yeah.
But how do you see Whitlam, or the memory of Whitlam and his policy? We see it at moments in like these romantic images in China during the. But is that it? Is it just a bit of Labor's, kind of collective memory, or is there sort of more of a sort of a policy tradition or connection?
Look, I think Gough Whitlam looms large in the Labor Party, no matter what generation you're from. I conclude in the book that he essentially saved the Labor Party, right? After 23 years in opposition, the party was unrepresentative, unimaginative, undemocratic, and he saved the Labor Party and returned it back to power. So he's always going to have a special place for that. And even as the scandals mount over the Loans affair, Jim and Junie, and all these kind of things in 1975, it was said that Labor Party members became experts on sport because they only read the back pages of the newspaper. And so the Labor Party has a memory problem with Whitlam. They remember the good things, not so much the bad things. And for Anthony Albanese, he came of age during the Whitlam government. And it's interesting, when he launched the book, he said that, for Paul Keating, he was Prime Minister during the 50th anniversary of John Curtin's Prime Ministership. And so Keating often found himself at anniversary moments recalling John Curtin and different things that he'd done, famous speeches and so on. And so for Albanese, it's the Whitlam government, the 50th anniversary is sort of echoing in his Prime Ministership. And so, I went to the opening of the Whitlam home in 2022, which has been saved and preserved now, where they lived in Cabramatta, the Whitlam family. and he was there opening it. And so he was talking about with the Whitlam government coming to power. And then, of course, he's there in China, as you mentioned, on the 50th anniversary of that. And then, of course, there's been these dismissal events, and he's been in Canberra talking about that. And so, yes, so sort of it's interesting how, history kind of echoes through, but he's very influenced by Whitlam. And his mentor was Tom Uren, who was a prisoner of war, a member of Parliament in the 1950s, and a minister, of course, in the Whitlam and Hawke government. So he's very influenced by that. And I should share with you that when I asked him to launch the book, he was very enthusiastic about that. I don't think because of me, I think because it was Gough Whitlam. But he was reading the book in the lead up to the launch, and he said he'd never read a book about another Prime Minister while he was Prime Minister. So he's learning as he's reading the book and thinking, how would I have acted in this situation? What would my response have been? Would I have had the same attitude or outlook, or how could I have handled something differently? So I think the book had a bit of an impact on him. But Whitlam does loom very large, not only for him, but for the Labor Party today. And he has a storied place, I think, among the true believers. And it was a scandalous and chaotic and dysfunctional government, but it is a turning point moment for the nation, and a lot of those achievements are big and they're lasting, whether it's education, health, foreign policy, even sewering the suburbs. The Whitlam government made a big mark.
All right, so it's time to go to our audience. So this is where you get to ask Troy a question, and I'd ask you to put up your hand, tell us your name, and ask a question. Please don't make long statements. So the floor is open. There's a gentleman in here. And sorry, wait for the microphone, Rachel.
Hi, Jersey Lee here. Thank you for the great presentation, and congratulations on the launch of the book. So in terms of a lot of the discussions about Australia's place in the world, one thing that several contemporary Australian historians, like for example James Curran, have noted is that there's a continued kind of, I guess, you could say it's a crisis or a kind of contradiction in Australia's self-identification in the world, between its European past and between, I guess, the Asia future. Although it's been an Asia future for like 50 years since basically Gough Whitlam. So given this kind of continued tension, how do you think this reflects on Whitlam's legacy, and how relevant are Whitlam's ideas about Australia's place in the world to today's situation?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good question, and certainly there's often been a debate in Australian policy where do we need to choose between our history or our geography? I mean, we are a very unique country here, that we have this historic relationship with Great Britain. We're still part of the British monarchy. Can you believe that? And yet we have this alliance relationship with the United States. Both of those countries are on the other side of the world, but yet we're in the Asia Pacific region. And so for a long time, governments had sort of almost ignored the region or hadn't placed the priority on it that Whitlam did. And so Whitlam went to every country pretty much in the Asia Pacific region over a long period of time, and he invested a lot in personal relationships. And so that is really important, and the Pacific relationships in our near region are also really significant. And I read a new book on Alexander Downer, a biography of him that's just been published, and wrote about this last weekend. And even Alexander Downer says that the Morrison government dropped the ball, is the phrase he uses in terms of the Pacific. And so Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong have made a huge impact in these Pacific countries. They're on first name basis with all these leaders in all these Pacific countries. And Whitlam did that too. And so that's an important legacy about making us sort of, lower our outlook to our own region rather than just running off to the United Kingdom and the United States. And so it's always that balancing act. And, David, you mentioned about the trips that Whitlam did. I mean, it's unbelievable. Even through the 1960s, he's in so many countries, and he's often meeting prime ministers and presidents and and monarchs and popes and, you name it. I mean, he met all these people and he invested so much in personal relationships, which is really important. And yes, he liked to, walk around ancient Greek and Roman ruins, but he also went to Peru and places in like South America where Australian Prime Ministers had never been to. I should say in Peru he did find time to go to Machu Picchu, but he also met the leaders of that country too. So it's an important question, and I think Whitlam did open up that field more wider about our relationships with a range of countries rather than just having an Anglophile outlook.
Gentleman in the back row.
Thank you. My name is Leon Berkelmans. I'd like you to just say a few words about Whitlam's attitude towards communism.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, of course, he would regard it. It's interesting. He regarded himself as a democratic socialist, and then later on changed that lexicon to social democratic. Is the terms he used. Communism is a really big issue in Australian politics in the 1940s, 1950s. And often, there's communist candidates running against him in the seat of Werra, for example, in the 1950s, where they might get, 10, 15% of the vote. Communism had a big impact in Australian politics for a long time. And, the Labor Party split in the 1950s over alleged communist influence. And interestingly, Whitlam spent 10 years living in Cronulla, from 1947 to 1957, and the Sutherland Shire was regarded as a bit of a haven for the Communist Party. It was a large membership there, and some of them were dual members of the Labor Party as well, which I write about, secret clandestine members. So he's very exposed to this as part of our politics. When it comes to his foreign policy, he saw nothing wrong at all with meeting the leader of a democratic country, or meeting the leader of a military dictatorship, or meeting a communist country, whether it's in the Soviet Union or in China, or a dictatorship like it was in Peru, for example. So he saw no difference there. He thought it was important to have relationships with all these countries. But it's a good question because often the criticism of Whitlam, say, going to China was that he's dealing with a communist leader. Whitlam saw that as not an issue whatsoever. It was about our trade relationship, our investment relationship, our cultural relationship, our people-to-people relationship. So again, he kind of helps to change that mindset, I guess, about prioritising different relationships, not based on political systems, but based on mutual interests.
He seemed to both sort of contain some of that he brought some of that liberal internationalism, we would call it now, but at the same time had quite a realist kind of view of the world and of the relationships that he should have. I saw that he was the first Prime Minister to travel to the Soviet Union, and of course, one of the controversial aspects was his recognition of the Baltic states, which Fraser did reverse.
That's right.
Or Soviet rule over the Baltic states.
I was just going to mention that, David. That's one of the more controversial aspects of his legacy. And as I tried to understand how he could possibly give recognition to these satellite states, I guess, these Baltic states for the Soviet Union control over them. There doesn't seem to be any cabinet discussion about them. There's no caucus discussion. There's no party discussion. He's simply just a memo that comes from his department, and he signs it off. And it's pure realpolitik. That was the basis. And so it's interesting. He didn't in some areas, he didn't place a great emphasis on, say, we'd call it human rights or liberalism. It was just that realpolitik approach, and that rubbed a lot of his colleagues the wrong way.
Yeah. We'll go to Andrea Gleeson in the back row.
Thank you. Troy, this has been absolutely fascinating. I've learnt a lot. But you said you were lucky enough to meet with Whitlam several times in his later years. And did you pick up from your conversations with him what he regarded as his greatest achievement or legacy on the foreign affairs realm? Was it recognition of the PRC or widening Australia's perspective and outlook, or PNG's independence? Did he have something that really meant a lot to him?
Yeah, I think the number one achievement he always said was free university education. That was something that he was most proud of across the board, and I sort of take a bit of a critical eye on that in the book because what I found was, I mean, he was someone who believed that universities should be open to anyone with talent and ability, right? If you want to advance your education, you should be able to do that. You shouldn't depend on how much money your parents have or your social status in the community. So I can understand why he had that view, say, about universities. But the reality is that the socio-economic cohort going to universities didn't really change much. And I tried to understand why that was. It enabled a lot of rich children from rich families to go to university for free. And the reason why a lot of students from, say, poorer suburbs, lower socio-economic backgrounds didn't go to university is because they didn't matriculate. They didn't do years 11 and 12, so they weren't really eligible for university. So that's nevertheless what he always said was his most proudest achievement, and that was unwound by the Hawke government in the mid-1980s. But it was going to China in terms of foreign policy. That was the one thing that he saw as the most significant. And, you know, I mean, there's a good claim for that. I mean, there's a couple of elements to say there without repeating what I've said before, but clearly this was opposed by the McMahon government and by the opposition at the time, and even Robert Menzies, for example, in retirement thought this was a terrible idea, recognising communist China. Yet we would all recognise today that, you know, more than 50 years later, this relationship, difficult to manage, problematic in some ways, is the basis for our economic prosperity. And so that's the one thing he was very, very proud of. And of course, he went back to China many, many times, even decades later, where he was welcomed as one of the most important leaders in that period of China's opening up to the world.
And I think they had this gentleman next.
Thank you, Greg Pittman. Thanks for the presentation. Could you tell us about the loans affair and why it was so damaging, and why didn't Gough Whitlam intervene to kill it early?
This is a long and complex story. I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. He had a blind spot, basically. This was absolutely riveting to write about in the book. I spent a lot of time on this. A lot of documents I got access to for the first time. A lot of people involved in aspects of this thing talked to me for the first time. And so essentially Rex Connor, the Minister for Minerals and Energy, had this dream of investing in minerals and energy projects, things like railway electrification, port upgrades, new uranium mines, can you believe that? Things like this, and we would become a global exporter for the world of these minerals that we had. And he learnt from, it's a bit complex, but Clyde Cameron was at a Greek ball in Adelaide, and he met a guy called Jerry Caritas, who's an Adelaide businessman, and I interviewed Jerry, and Jerry came up, Jerry said there's money that can be tapped from the Middle East, where these oil sheiks had become rich because of the oil shocks, and they needed places to spend their money. And so the idea came up that you could get a cheap loan. And so the word went out from Australia that they were looking for someone to broker this loan. And a man called Tirath Kemlani, who is a Pakistani commodities trader and an arms dealer, he was in Amsterdam when he learned of this, and he got on the first plane to Australia. And what the memos from the public servants show is that, you know, Connor had these dollar signs in his eyes, and he convinced Whitlam of this, and Connor's a big person in the Labor Party, really powerful person in the caucus, a Whitlam supporter in cabinet, and so Whitlam went along with it. But the public servants knew from the get-go that Kemlani was a con man, and they said it from the beginning that he was a con man. This was known as a funny money offer, and the idea was that Kemlani wanted for a US $4 billion loan that he would secure, he wanted a 2.5% commission paid up front. The mathematics on that is $100 million US to be paid at the moment he's authorised to find the loan. Public servants worked very fast to make sure there was no upfront commission. Commission will be payable when the money is received, but the Federal Executive Council, not the Cabinet, not the caucus, not the Loan Council, not the states, signed off on this arrangement without knowing who the lender was, what the bank was that would receive the money, or when it would be received. And so the money never came. And the public servants I interviewed, you know, who went to Zurich to meet Kemlani, said he never showed up. The money wasn't available at the bank. They said They'd never heard of anyone called Tirath Kamlani, and this sounds like a con. And so the public servant who I interviewed literally got on a payphone outside the bank, rang Canberra and said, he's a con man, but they weren't worried about it. And they kept reauthorising Kamlani to pursue this loan, which of course never happened. And then this is what is the slow burning wick that leads to the dismissal. Because Rex Connor is found to have misled Parliament on his negotiations with Kamlani, and that leads Malcolm Fraser to block supply, and blocking supply leads to the dismissal. So it's an incredible story, I think told in a lot more detail and interesting way than before. And I'm very proud of that part of the book, but it is a madcap scheme from beginning to end. It is both farce and tragedy. So I love talking about it, but I hope you get to read it.
Well, I found it was like an unfolding train wreck, the Loans Affair. Just reading it, you could just kind of see that this is doomed, and then you enter the psychodrama of the dismissal.
Yeah.
Right. We've got time for maybe two more if we can get them in. So, gentlemen here.
Hi, Troy.
Hi.
My name's Ben.
Yes.
Thank you for your books. They're real gifts, and they certainly take pride in place in my library.
Thank you.
You might be reticent to weigh in on hypotheticals, but I'd be surprised if you hadn't turned your mind to it, so I'll ask. Suppose that the Whitlam government hadn't embarked on minerals reform. How would the rest of the term transpired, and how would history remember Whitlam?
Look, Whitlam was always going to be remembered as a big achiever because the achievements are big. I've mentioned some of them earlier. I mean, that's a turning point moment for the nation. They are big and they are lasting. A lot of government's achievements get forgotten or they get overturned. That didn't happen with Whitlam. But by 1975, the government was dealing with rising unemployment, rising uninflation, a global recession, scandals within the government involving a range of ministers, and economic policy is a big failure of the government. There's 4 treasurers in the Whitlam government. There's Whitlam for several weeks, then there's Frank Crean, then Jim Cairns, then Bill Hayden. So 4 treasurers in less than 3 years. And none of them, except Bill, had a really good grasp of the economic challenges or how to respond to them. So you get these crazy submissions going to Cabinet where Jim Cairns, for example, starts a Cabinet submission where he's advocating a point of view, then second-guessing it halfway through, then at the end he's disagreeing with it. And then he eventually says, I believe in the economics of love. So I don't know what that means. I don't think anyone in the Cabinet knew either. So it's pretty crazy. So look, I mean, the Whitlam government, without the Loans Affair and the dismissal, probably would have come unstuck within a few years. And, there was an election due in mid-1977. It's hard to see how they would have won that. There's some green shoots of hope, I think, with Bill Hayden becoming treasurer and trying to turn things around. But it would have been a tall order, I think.
All right, one last question. Serena?
Thank you so much, Troy. My name is Serena. I'm from the Lowy Institute. Obviously, I am from Papua New Guinea, and this is a very important year for us. I want to just reflect on this statement that was made by Gough Whitlam at the time of our independence. He said, Australia could never be truly free until Papua New Guinea was truly free.
Yeah.
In a very real sense, this is a day of liberation for Australia as much as it is for Papua New Guinea. I'd like you to reflect on that statement, particularly in this world we live in where countries all across Europe, America, are dealing with their colonial legacy. I mean, I think that's a gift for Australia, so could you reflect a bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we should have mentioned this earlier, but independence for Papua New Guinea is a big achievement of the Whitlam government. It was bipartisan. I interviewed Andrew Peacock, who'd been the minister in the previous government. He said that was the highlight of his ministerial career, was helping to try to unite the different people of Papua New Guinea towards independence. He wasn't able to achieve it because they ran out of time. But Whitlam had visited Papua New Guinea many times in the 1960s and all through that period, and was a big believer in independence. We talked about the process of decolonisation. He had the view that Australia should give up Papua New Guinea at the end of World War II. He could see no sense as to why we'd want to hold on to this other country. And so he was a big believer in that. But, when I went through the records and looked at what people were saying, a lot of people were arguing that, and some people in Papua New Guinea too, that they wouldn't be ready for independence until maybe 1980 or even later than that. But Whitlam knew they could do it. And so he made this a priority. And he put someone like Bill Morrison on the case, who a former diplomat, to try to elevate this process and escalate it. And he did that. And so by September 1975, they're all there for the independence ceremony and the beginning of a new era. So it's a big achievement, but it's a good lesson about leadership. Yes, they could have waited until 1980, but Whitlam saw a faster pathway, and they only were able to do that, I think, through leadership. So that's one of the important messages of the book, is leadership matters in politics, and leaders can help people see opportunities that others can't see. And he certainly did that on Papua New Guinea.
Well, thank you. That's a lovely quote. I really like that. Thank you for reading that out. We are out of time, so let me congratulate Troy again on I think a wonderful book. I read it back to front. It's a big book. You can see it back there, where you'll soon have the opportunity to buy your own copy. And I think Troy's going to sign some books. So please, for those of you in the room, hang around, ask another question, get your book signed. Thank you very much for those who have joined online as well. That really brings us to the end. Would you all thank Troy for joining us tonight?
Thank you.